In the vast, unforgiving expanse of the Tunisian desert, silence often speaks louder than cannon fire. In the shimmering heat of February 1943, near the scorched earth of the Kasserine Pass, a group of German officers and engineers stood in a circle, their boots kicking at the dust. The battle was over, for now. Before them sat not a destroyed enemy, but a prize of war, captured almost perfectly intact. It was an American M4A1 Sherman tank, its olive drab paint covered in a fine layer of pale sand. To these men, disciples of German engineering supremacy, it looked ordinary, almost crude. It was a product of mass production, a tool built by factory workers, not by artisans of war. They saw it as an object to be dissected, its secrets catalogued, its weaknesses exposed to confirm their own superiority. They thought they had captured a tank. They had no idea they had just armed a time bomb. This was not a bomb of steel and high explosives, but one of an infinitely more dangerous substance. A devastating truth. A truth that would tick away quietly in the heart of the Third Reich's war machine, threatening to shatter the very foundation of its engineering pride. This tank, which some historical accounts suggest was given the internal designation War Daddy II, was about to begin a journey, not just across the desert, but into the very soul of German industrial ideology. And it would leave a scar that would never truly heal. The first leg of its journey was a grueling 220-mile trek from the battlefield to the port city of Sfax. For the German recovery crew assigned to transport it, this was a routine, if tedious task. They were intimately familiar with the brutal nature of the desert. The fine, abrasive sand worked its way into everything. Engines, transmissions, gun breeches grinding down the most sophisticated machinery with indifferent cruelty. Their own formidable tanks, the Tigers and Panthers, that were still in their early stages of deployment, were known to be temperamental beasts. They were masterpieces of theoretical power, but they often broke down under the strain of prolonged movement, their complex systems demanding constant, expert maintenance. The German crew expected, almost looked forward to, the Sherman's inevitable failure. They anticipated a breakdown in the transmission, an engine seizure under the blistering African sun. Each mile they traveled was a testament to their own patience, as they waited for the American machine to succumb to the same mechanical frailties that plagued their own armor. But the failure never came. The Sherman just kept going. It rumbled on, its Wright Continental R-975 engine, an adaptation of a famously reliable aircraft engine, humming with a steady, uncomplaining rhythm. Its simple, robust suspension handled the uneven terrain without protest. Every mile marker it passed was another tick of the clock. Every hour it operated without a single mechanical issue was a quiet, damning accusation against their own design philosophy. This machine wasn't supposed to be this resilient. It was built with looser tolerances, with parts designed for rapid replacement, not for perfection. Yet here it was, performing a feat of endurance that would have been a serious challenge for their own supposedly superior panzers. The journey to Sfax wasn't merely a logistical transfer. It became the first, unnerving piece of evidence in a case that would soon be presented to the highest echelons of the German High Command. The time bomb had been set, its fuse lit by the African sun, and it was now on a ship, crossing the Mediterranean, destined for the one place where its truth could do the most damage. Kommersdorf, the top-secret heart of German military research and development. This is not a story about the thunder of tank battles or the heroism of crews in the heat of combat. It is the story of a quieter, more insidious war. A war of ideas, fought with wrenches and calipers, on proving grounds and in engineering labs. It is the story of how one simple, unassuming American tank became a silent witness, forcing Hitler's most brilliant minds to confront a terrifying possibility, that in their obsessive pursuit of mechanical perfection, they had completely misunderstood the mathematics of modern warfare. They had built weapons to win a theoretical battle of specifications, while the Americans had built a machine designed for one purpose only: to win the actual war. And the evidence of this profound miscalculation was now on its way to the heart of the Reich. Before the first bolt was turned on, the captured Sherman at the Kummersdorf proving grounds, a battle had already been raging for years. It was a battle of ideas, a fundamental conflict between two industrial philosophies that were as different as the societies that birthed them. On one side stood the German approach, the philosophy of the master craftsman. To the German engineer, a tank like a tiger or a panther was not merely a machine of war. It was a masterpiece, a symphony of steel and precision engineering. Each component was designed to be the absolute best it could be, manufactured to the tightest possible tolerances by a skilled workforce. They were artisans of destruction, and their creations were a source of immense national pride. This philosophy produced weapons that, on paper, were terrifyingly superior. They had thicker armor, more powerful guns, and more sophisticated optics. But this pursuit of perfection came at a staggering cost. These machines were incredibly complex, difficult to produce in large numbers, and a logistical nightmare to maintain. They required specialized tools, highly trained mechanics, and a supply chain that could deliver precise, custom-made parts to the front lines. In essence, Germany was sending handcrafted, thoroughbred race cars into a brutal demolition derby. On the other side of this philosophical divide was the American approach, the philosophy of the assembly line. The American war machine was not run by artisans. It was run by the spiritual descendants of Henry Ford. Their guiding principle was not perfection, but mass-producible reliability. The American engineer, drawing on decades of experience in the civilian automotive industry, asked a different set of questions. Not, how can we make the single best component, but how can we make 100,000 components that are good enough? Not, how do we build a tank that can defeat any other tank, but how do we build a tank that a farmer from Ohio, drafted and given 6 weeks of training, can operate and help fix with a standard-issue wrench? The Sherman was the embodiment of this thinking. It wasn't designed to be the best. It was designed to be there. It was a tool, not a trophy. Its parts were interchangeable, its systems were straightforward, and its maintenance was simple enough to be performed in a muddy field, far from a dedicated factory workshop. This was a direct reflection of a different kind of society, not a stratified, militaristic state, but a vast, democratic, industrial powerhouse that understood the power of scale. This clash of ideologies was not an abstract debate. It had devastating real-world consequences, creating a deep and painful rift between the political leadership in Berlin and the soldiers on the front lines. In the halls of power, officials saw the blueprints for the Panther and marveled at its sloped armor and its high-velocity 75mm cannon. They listened to reports of Tigers shrugging off dozens of hits from Russian cannons. They believed, with an almost religious fervor, in the myth of their own technological supremacy. They were winning the war on paper, and the propaganda machine ensured the German people believed it too. But for the young panzer commander, shivering in the Russian winter, that paper meant nothing. His reality was the gut-wrenching sound of a final drive shattering, leaving his 50-ton masterpiece, stranded and helpless. He lived with a constant, gnawing anxiety that had little to do with the enemy. It was the fear of betrayal by his own machine. For every hour spent in combat, his crew might spend 10 hours performing delicate, complex maintenance, praying that a crucial gear or bearing wouldn't fail at the worst possible moment. The letters sent home from the Eastern Front sometimes contained a bitter, unspoken irony. We have the finest tanks in the world when they are running. This was the personal conflict born from a political delusion, the agonizing gap between the promise of an invincible weapon and the reality of a fragile, over-engineered machine. And now, into this environment of supreme self-confidence and quiet desperation, rolled War Daddy 2. As it sat in the sterile, ordered environment of the Kummersdorf facility, it was more than just a captured vehicle. It was a physical manifestation of the enemy's entire industrial might and philosophy. The German engineers, men who had dedicated their lives to the pursuit of mechanical perfection, prepared to peel back its steel skin. They were the judges, and this crude American machine was on trial. They fully expected to find evidence of shoddy workmanship, of cost-cutting measures, of a primitive design that would reaffirm their own superiority. They were about to begin their meticulous dissection, searching for weakness. They had no idea they were about to find a form of genius they had never even considered. The real monster wasn't the tank itself, but the shockingly simple and robust ideas hidden within it. What secrets were waiting inside that olive-drab hull? The Kummersdorf facility was the hallowed ground of German engineering, a place where theory and steel were forged into weapons of war. Within its sterile workshops, the high priests of precision mechanics began their work on the captured Sherman. The process was meant to be an autopsy, not an analysis. It was a ritual intended to confirm their own deeply held beliefs, that American industry was incapable of the sophisticated design required for a superior fighting vehicle. They expected to find a crude machine, hammered together with little thought for elegance or longevity. The initial report, they assumed, would be a simple catalogue of compromises and shortcuts. They were about to find something far more revolutionary. The first major shock came from the very core of the machine, the transmission and final drive assembly. This was the Achilles heel of their own magnificent beasts, the Panther and the Tiger. Their own systems were marvels of complexity, requiring immense skill to operate and a watchmaker's precision to maintain. The German engineers unscrewed the Sherman's heavy steel casing, expecting to find a similarly intricate and likely inferior arrangement of gears. Instead, they were met with a design of what could only be described as brutal elegance. The power was transferred through a set of massive herringbone gears. Unlike the straight-cut spur gears common in many applications, the V-shaped teeth of a herringbone gear engage gradually and smoothly across their entire surface. This simple, clever design self-centers, distributes the immense torque of the engine more evenly, and is incredibly durable. It didn't require the obsessive, microscopic tolerances the Germans prided themselves on. It was a design that forgave minor imperfections in manufacturing, a design built for the brutal reality of the battlefield, not the idealized perfection of a blueprint. Puzzlement turned to intrigue. What other secrets did this deceptively simple machine hold? They moved on to the gearbox itself. For a German panzer driver, changing gears was a brutal, physically demanding art. It often required a technique known as double clutching, a difficult, noisy process that, if done incorrectly, could result in stripped gears and a disabled tank. It took strength, timing, and a deep mechanical sympathy with the machine. The American solution inside the Sherman seemed almost laughably simple. A synchromesh gearbox, much like one might find in a civilian truck back in the States. This technology, which uses synchronizer rings to match the speed of the gears before they engage, made shifting smooth, fast, and nearly foolproof. A German engineer noted with a sense of disbelief that an American tanker could be trained to drive the vehicle proficiently in a fraction of the time it took to master a German tank. The Americans hadn't just built a machine, they had considered the human inside it. They had prioritized ease of use and reduced operator fatigue, recognizing that a tired, stressed crew was an inefficient one. This wasn't just a different design, it was a different way of thinking about the relationship between man and machine in war. The final piece of the puzzle was the engine. It wasn't the most powerful or the most technologically advanced power plant. It was the Continental R975, a radial engine that had begun its life powering airplanes in the 1,930 seconds. The German engineers, accustomed to their own high-performance, water-cooled Maybach engines, might have initially scoffed at this air-cooled dinosaur. But they quickly realized its genius. This engine had already been perfected through millions of hours of flight time, an environment where reliability is a matter of life and death. It was a known quantity. It was a workhorse, not a show horse. It was designed to run for hundreds of hours between major overhauls and was simple enough that a trained mechanic could perform significant repairs or even a complete engine swap in the field in a matter of hours. The contrast was stark. A German Panther engine was a sensitive, high-strung thoroughbred that required constant coddling and factory-level expertise to maintain. The Sherman's engine was a stubborn mule that just refused to quit. As the reports piled up on the desks of the Kummersdorf supervisors, a new picture began to emerge. It was a deeply unsettling one. Each component they analyzed, from the suspension to the electrical systems, told the same story. The Americans were not competing in the same race. The Germans were striving to build the perfect instrument of war. The Americans were building the most reliable tool. The initial contempt of the engineers slowly melted away, replaced by a grudging, almost fearful respect. The Sherman wasn't a masterpiece of individual components, but a masterpiece of integration, reliability, and industrial philosophy. These were just numbers and diagrams on paper, findings confined to the secrecy of internal reports. But what would happen when this quiet, reliable machine was asked to perform, not in a sterile lab, but in front of the very men who had staked their careers, and the fate of the Reich, on the myth of the Panther and the Tiger? A public demonstration was being arranged, and the Sherman was about to turn their secret reports into a very public humiliation. In the early summer of 1943, a sense of nervous anticipation hung in the air at a German proving ground, possibly the one at Hillersleben. This was not just another routine equipment test. This was a spectacle. In attendance was a man whose opinion could shape the future of the entire German war effort. Albert Speer, the powerful Minister of Armaments and War Production. Flanked by skeptical generals and expectant designers, Speer had come to witness the might of Germany's next generation of panzers. The stars of the show were meant to be the Panther, the sleek new medium tank designed to dominate the battlefields of the Eastern Front, and the Ferdinand, a monstrous 70-ton tank destroyer, a veritable fortress on tracks. Almost as an afterthought, an oddity for comparison, the captured American Sherman, War Daddy 2, was also scheduled to perform. For the German High Command, it was intended to be a moment of triumph, a demonstration that would vindicate their massive investment in complex cutting-edge technology. It would become a moment of excruciating clarity. The test was deceptively simple, designed to showcase raw power and mechanical integrity. Each vehicle was to climb a moderately steep dirt embankment. It was a basic test of a tank's engine torque, and more importantly, the durability of its final drive, the complex set of gears that transfers power from the engine to the tracks. It was a known point of stress for heavy armored vehicles, and for the German engineers who had studied the Sherman, it was a moment of quiet, intense focus. They knew the secrets hidden in the reports from Kummersdorf. But now, theory was about to collide with a very public reality. First came the pride of the Panzerwaffe, the Panther. With a deafening roar from its Maybach engine, the tank surged forward. It was a magnificent sight, a predator of steel, its long 75mm cannon pointing towards the sky like a lance. It hit the base of the incline with impressive speed, its tracks churning up clouds of dust and dirt. But then, a subtle change in the engine's roar. A moment of hesitation. The tank strained, its powerful engine screaming, but its forward momentum faltered. While it may have eventually clawed its way up, the display was far from the effortless dominance everyone expected. The whispers began among the assembled officers. The sophisticated interleaved road wheels and complex transmission, so brilliant on paper, seemed to be struggling under the immense strain. Next, the earth itself seemed to tremble as the Ferdinand behemoth lumbered forward. It was less a tank and more a mobile artillery piece, armed with a colossal 88mm gun capable of destroying any Allied tank from miles away. It approached the embankment with a slow, grinding inevitability. Then, with a sickening lurch and a plume of black smoke, it simply stopped. Dead. The engine had failed. One of the Third Reich's most fearsome new weapons was now nothing more than a 70-ton monument to mechanical failure, sitting immobile and disgraced in front of the one man they needed to impress the most. The silence that followed was heavy with embarrassment and frustration. Finally, it was the Sherman's turn. It looked small, almost agricultural, compared to the German giants. There was no dramatic roar, just the steady, business-like hum of its radial engine. It approached the embankment at a constant, unhurried pace. Without a hint of strain, without a moment's hesitation, it simply drove up the slope. Its suspension articulated smoothly, its tracks maintained a firm grip, and it crested the hill with an air of complete indifference. It just worked. It performed the task quietly, efficiently, and reliably. There was no drama, because drama is often the byproduct of a system pushed to its breaking point. The Sherman was operating well within its limits. In that single, stark visual contrast, the volumes of secret data from Kummersdorf were made real. All the technical specifications, all the talk of superior firepower and thicker armor, evaporated in the face of one simple, undeniable fact. The American tank worked when it was supposed to. According to some historical narratives, the impact on Albert Speer was profound. He was a pragmatist, an architect, and an organizer who understood production and logistics. He reportedly admitted with astonishing candor in the Nazi Party newspaper, Das Reich, that the Americans, drawing from their vast experience in automobile manufacturing, had achieved a level of automotive engineering in their tanks that Germany could not match. It was a stunning public admission of a deeply uncomfortable truth. This wasn't just a technical failure, it was a moral one. The regime was demanding immense sacrifices from its people and soldiers for the production of wonder weapons that were proving to be fatally flawed. They were squandering the nation's dwindling resources on over-engineered pride projects, while the enemy was fielding a simple, reliable tool of war in overwhelming numbers. The public humiliation was a crack in the myth of German superiority, but the data flooding in from the real battlefield was about to turn that crack into a chasm. The embarrassing spectacle at Hillersleben was a single, stark snapshot in time, but as the summer of 1943 bled into the brutal winter and the decisive year of 1944, a flood of data began pouring into the German high command from every front. This was not anecdotal evidence or the subjective opinion of a few engineers. This was a storm of raw, undeniable numbers, after-action reports, maintenance logs, and casualty assessments that painted a picture far more devastating than one failed demonstration. The quiet ticking of the War Daddy 2 time bomb had now become a deafening roar of statistical truth, echoing from the muddy fields of Russia to the hedgerows of Normandy. The first set of numbers to cause alarm came from the Germans' own exhaustive testing. Their engineers, with their characteristic thoroughness, had pushed captured Shermans to their absolute limits. The results were sobering. They found that a Sherman could consistently operate for over 1,200 miles, approximately 2,000 kilometers, before requiring a major engine or transmission overhaul. This was a staggering figure. For comparison, the magnificent but delicate Maybach engine in their prized Panther tank had an average life expectancy that was often reported to be as low as 600 miles, less than 1,000 kilometers, under harsh combat conditions. Some reports even suggested a full engine replacement might be needed after just a few hundred miles. This meant that for every Panther engine that was built, shipped to the front, and installed, the Americans could expect their Sherman to travel 3 times the distance. It was a logistical multiplier of immense power, a hidden advantage that didn't appear on any specification sheet. But the most damning statistic, the number that truly exposed the catastrophic failure of the German design philosophy, was operational readiness. This single metric cuts through all the propaganda and theoretical arguments to answer the most important question in warfare. How many of your weapons are actually available to fight on any given day? The numbers for the elite panzer divisions were horrifying. Reports from the Eastern Front in 1944 showed that the operational readiness rate for the Panther tank frequently fell below 40%. On some disastrous days, for some units, it plummeted to a catastrophic 16%. Imagine being a general commanding a division of 100 tanks, only to be told that 84 of them are sitting in workshops, waiting for spare parts or specialized mechanics. In contrast, American Sherman battalions consistently maintained readiness rates well above 80% and often surpassed 90%. The math was brutal and inescapable. An American commander with 100 Shermans could reliably send 80 or 90 tanks into battle. A German commander with 100 Panthers was lucky if he could field 40. This abstract data had a profound psychological impact on the men in the field, creating two vastly different combat experiences. For the German panzer crew, a new kind of fear began to take hold, one that was entirely separate from the fear of the enemy. It was the fear of mechanical betrayal. Every strange clank from the transmission, every sputter from the engine, was a potential death sentence. They went into battle not just wondering if they would survive the enemy's fire, but if their own tank would even make it to the fight. Confidence, that vital ingredient of a soldier's courage, was being eroded not by enemy action, but by the unreliability of their own equipment. For the American tanker, the experience was the opposite. He might have been acutely aware that his Sherman's armor was thinner than a Panther's, or that his 75mm gun struggled to penetrate a Tiger's frontal plate. But he had a deep, abiding faith in his machine. He knew that when the order came to advance, his engine would start. He knew his transmission wouldn't fail him in the middle of a firefight. This mechanical reliability was the bedrock of his courage. It allowed him to focus on the enemy, confident that his tank would do its job. In a surprising twist, this confidence was mirrored by some on the German side. Reports and battlefield anecdotes began to surface of German units, who eagerly took captured Shermans into service. They would quickly paint a large Balkan cross on the hull and turret to avoid friendly fire and use them with enthusiasm. For these pragmatic soldiers, a working enemy tank was infinitely more valuable than a superior German tank sitting broken on the side of a road. The storm of data was revealing a fundamental truth. The war was not being won by the tank with the biggest gun, but by the tank that showed up to the battle. And the reasons for this disparity went far beyond the design of the vehicles themselves, reaching deep into the industrial heartlands of the two warring powers. The consistent failure of Germany's most advanced tanks and the stubborn resilience of the American Sherman were not isolated incidents of good or bad design. They were symptoms of a much larger, unseen conflict being waged hundreds of miles from any battlefield. This was a war of production, a brutal contest between two fundamentally different industrial systems. The outcome of this war, fought in the sprawling factory complexes of Detroit and the besieged industrial heartlands of the Ruhr Valley, was arguably more decisive than any single tank battle. The fatal flaws of the Panther and Tiger were not born on the drawing board, but were forged in the very nature of Germany's wartime economy. The German industrial machine, once the envy of the world, was being systematically choked to death. Allied strategic bombing campaigns had evolved from indiscriminate attacks on cities to a precise, surgical assault on the critical nodes of German war production. Bombers relentlessly targeted factories that produced essential, high-precision components, ball bearings, fuel injectors, and crucially, the complex gear-cutting machinery required for transmissions and final drives. This created a devastating bottleneck. A Tiger tank might be 95% complete, waiting in a factory, but it was useless without a handful of specialized bearings that could no longer be produced to the required quality or in the required numbers. This forced German engineers into a desperate cycle of compromises. They were compelled to use inferior materials, such as alloys with less nickel or molybdenum, making vital parts more brittle and prone to failure. The very precision their designs demanded became their greatest vulnerability. Furthermore, the German workforce was hollowed out. Millions of skilled German workers were serving at the front, replaced in the factories by a vast, sorrowful army of slave laborers from conquered territories. These were people working under brutal conditions, driven by fear, not pride or patriotism. They lacked the training, the motivation, and often the simple physical strength to maintain the high standards of quality control that German engineering prided itself on. A single, poorly manufactured gear, a bearing that was off by a fraction of a millimeter, could cause a catastrophic failure in a complex transmission system weeks later on the Eastern Front. The industrial base was cracking under the dual pressures of aerial bombardment and a demoralized, unskilled workforce. In stark contrast, the American industrial heartland was an ocean away, a fortress of production untouched by enemy bombs. The United States unleashed an economic force the world had never seen. Companies like Ford, Chrysler, and General Motors, which had spent decades perfecting the art of mass-producing reliable automobiles for a civilian market, seamlessly transitioned to building tanks, planes, and ships. They already had the factories, the machine tools, and most importantly, the expertise in efficient, large-scale assembly. A company like the Lima Locomotive Works, which had spent years building durable steam locomotives, applied the exact same principles of robust engineering to manufacturing the Sherman tank. The American workforce was another decisive advantage. It was a well-paid, highly skilled, and deeply motivated civilian labor force. The Rosie the Riveter archetype was not propaganda. It was a reality in countless factories. These were workers who understood the principles of mass production and quality control because it was part of their cultural DNA. They were not building delicate, handcrafted masterpieces. They were building thousands upon thousands of standardized, interchangeable parts, creating a river of steel that flowed across the Atlantic. This system produced a logistical miracle. Not only could they build more tanks, they could also produce an overwhelming supply of spare parts. If a Sherman's engine failed in the field, a replacement could be pulled from a crate and installed in hours. If a Panther's engine failed, it often meant a long, and increasingly unlikely, trip back to a factory-level depot in the rear. The ultimate irony was that Germany's quest for technical perfection made its war machine incredibly fragile, while America's focus on good-enough pragmatism created a system that was immensely resilient. The complex German designs were brittle. A single point of failure could disable the entire machine. The simpler, modular American designs could absorb punishment, be repaired with basic tools, and sent back into the fight. The war of production was a war of attrition, and Germany's industrial philosophy was bleeding it dry. With their factories in ruins and their tanks failing faster than they could be repaired, the German leadership could no longer hide behind blueprints and propaganda. A final, bitter reckoning was at hand. A moment when the generals themselves would have to formally acknowledge that the foundation of their armored might had crumbled from within. By January of 1945, the war was hurtling towards its violent conclusion. The Ardennes offensive, Hitler's last great gamble in the West, had failed, shattering the last reserves of German armored strength. On the Eastern Front, the Red Army was closing in on the borders of the Reich itself. Inside the cold, austere meeting rooms of Berlin, the atmosphere was not one of defiance, but of grim, desperate accounting. The time for propaganda and self-delusion was over. Reality, cold and unforgiving, was kicking down the door. It was in this environment that a meeting of the Panzer Commission was convened, a gathering of the very men responsible for Germany's armored warfare doctrine and production. It was here that the time bomb set in the Tunisian desert 2 years prior would finally, officially, detonate. Presiding over this somber assembly was a man who was both a legend and a realist, General Heinz Guderian. He was one of the architects of the Blitzkrieg, a brilliant tactician who understood armored warfare better than almost anyone. But he was also a pragmatist who had spent years fighting not just the enemy, but also the frustrating inefficiencies of his own country's production system. He had seen the magnificent tigers and panthers firsthand, but he had also seen them stranded by the roadside, victims of their own complexity. Now, he sat and listened as a series of devastating internal reports were presented. These were not battlefield rumors. They were the final, unvarnished conclusions from his own experts. The reports confirmed in chilling detail what the data storm had been screaming for over a year. The primary cause of tank losses, particularly for the technologically advanced Panther, was not enemy fire. It was mechanical failure. The numbers were catastrophic. An astonishingly high percentage of losses were attributed to vehicles simply being abandoned by their crews after breaking down. The most critical point of failure, the report stated with brutal clarity, was the final drive. This single, overstressed component, the very part that had so impressed the engineers when they examined the Sherman's robust herringbone gears, was the Achilles heel of the entire Panther fleet. The constant breakdowns had a cascading effect, overwhelming the repair and recovery services and creating a graveyard of abandoned panzers across Europe. In that room, a profound and terrible admission finally took place. It was the confession that their army had lost faith in its own primary weapon. The crews, the young men tasked with fighting in these steel behemoths, no longer trusted their machines to carry them into battle and back. This psychological collapse was, in many ways, more damaging than the material losses. A soldier who fears his own equipment is a soldier half defeated before the first shot is even fired. The entire German philosophy of technological superiority, the belief that German engineering could produce invincible weapons to overcome any numerical disadvantage, had crumbled into dust. The story of War Daddy 2 was the perfect, haunting microcosm of this entire strategic failure. Let us revisit that image. A single, unassuming American tank, captured in the desert. It wasn't a weapon of shocking power. It didn't possess a gun that could change the tactical calculus of a battle. Its secret weapon was far more subtle and far more powerful: reliability. It represented a philosophy that valued function over form, endurance over elegance. It was the quiet, persistent voice of reason that the German war machine had tried, and failed, to ignore. The bomb that had been ticking away since 1943 had finally exploded, not in a ball of fire on the battlefield, but in the silent, horrified acknowledgement of the men in that commission room. The sound of that explosion was the shattering of a nation's engineering pride. The conflict at the heart of our story, the great debate between theoretical performance and battlefield reliability, had reached its definitive resolution. Reliability hadn't just won, it had utterly vanquished its rival. But what would be the legacy of this hard-won lesson? What would rise from the ashes of this collapsed ideology? And how would the simple, stubborn Sherman continue to shape the future long after the war was over? The unconditional surrender of Germany in May 1945 marked the end of the war in Europe, but the lessons learned in the crucible of conflict were just beginning to be understood. The story of War Daddy 2 and the subsequent collapse of faith in Germany's complex panzers was not just a historical footnote. It became a foundational lesson in modern military design and philosophy. The ultimate triumph of the Sherman was not a victory of superior technology in the way the Germans understood it. It was a victory of a superior system, a system of design, production, and logistics that prioritized battlefield availability above all else. The most powerful weapon in the world is useless if it's stuck in a repair depot. The greatest tank ever designed is worthless if you can only build a few hundred of them. The Sherman taught the world a simple, profound truth. The best weapon is the one that's there, and working when you need it most. This lesson was not lost on the defeated. In the years following the war, as West Germany was rebuilt and integrated into the NATO alliance, its new generation of engineers was tasked with designing a new main battle tank for the Bundeswehr. They had access to all the old wartime research, the brilliant but flawed designs for the Panther II, the Tiger II, and even more advanced concepts. They could have chosen to walk the same path, to once again pursue the most powerful gun and the thickest armor at any cost. But they didn't. Instead, they studied the Sherman. They studied its balance, its mechanical reliability, and the industrial philosophy that had allowed America to produce it in such overwhelming numbers. The result was the Leopard 1. Introduced in the 1960 seconds, the Leopard was a stunning departure from wartime German design. It was fast, agile, and famously reliable. It prioritized mobility and dependability over sheer brute force, becoming one of the most successful and widely adopted tanks of the Cold War era. In a moment of supreme historical irony, the legacy of the humble American Sherman found its most devoted student in the engineering halls of its former enemy. The lesson had been learned, The story of the Sherman versus the Panther is more than just a tale of tanks. It's a timeless parable that resonates even today. In our modern world, we are constantly surrounded by the allure of complexity. We see it in our smartphones, packed with features we rarely use. We see it in software bloated with unnecessary code. We see it in corporate strategies, so convoluted they become impossible to execute. We are constantly tempted to believe that more is always better. More features, more power, more complexity. We chase the theoretical perfection of the Panther, forgetting the simple, rugged reliability of the Sherman. We forget that in business, in technology, and even in our own lives, the systems that endure are rarely the most complex. They are the ones that are robust, adaptable, and simply work when put under pressure. The German engineers who first inspected War Daddy 2 in the Tunisian desert thought they were looking at a crude, inferior machine. What they were actually looking at was the future. They were looking at a testament to the idea that true genius isn't always found in complexity, but often in simplicity and reliability. It's a lesson about engineering, but it's also a profound lesson about life. The most effective solutions are often the most straightforward ones. The strongest foundations are built on simple, solid principles. And this brings us to you, the philosophy of the Sherman, prioritizing what works over what merely looks impressive, is a powerful concept. In your own life, your career, or your personal projects, have you ever seen this principle in action? Have you ever witnessed a simple, reliable approach triumph over a more complex, flashy, but ultimately fragile one? We genuinely want to hear your story. Share your experiences and your perspective in the comments section below. Your insights are what make this community a place for real discussion. And if you were captivated by this hidden story of industrial warfare and the surprising truths buried in the history of World War II, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. There are so many more secrets from the past waiting to be uncovered, and you won't want to miss a single one. Thank you for joining us on this journey.